Evelyn Chase had spent $100 million to stay alive. The finest specialists on the planet had reviewed her case. The most expensive experimental protocols in the world had been administered in a private suite on the 14th floor of her own building. And still, month after month, she grew weaker. Her hands trembled when no one was watching. Her vision blurred on mornings when the treatment should have been helping. Not one person in her army of credentialed, well-compensated experts stopped to ask why she was getting worse instead of better. Only one man noticed. He was pushing a mop cart down the hallway when he saw her hands resting on the armrest of the infusion chair, and what he saw changed everything. Isaac Callaway left his apartment at 5:45 every morning. He made 2 scrambled eggs, packed a thermos of black coffee, and walked his 7-year-old daughter Grace 3 blocks to the Maple Street Early Learning Center before doubling back to the subway. It was a routine worn smooth by repetition, and he moved through it with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned not to waste anything. Not time, not energy, not hope. Grace always tucked something into his jacket pocket before he left for work. Most mornings it was a folded drawing. This particular Tuesday, she pressed a square of paper into his hand at the drop-off gate and said, without looking up from her backpack buckle, "It's you fixing people, Ba." He unfolded it on the train. A crayon figure in gray clothes, holding what appeared to be both a wrench and a stethoscope, standing next to a tall building with many windows. He folded it carefully and slid it into his breast pocket, over his heart. The 14th floor of Nexavance Corporation did not look like a place where someone went to work a janitorial shift. The hallways were floored in pale marble, lit by recessed LED panels that never flickered. The air smelled of something clinical and expensive. The specific scent of a facility maintained not for function but for the suggestion of safety. Isaac had been assigned here 9 months ago after a background check that his supervisor said was more thorough than any the building had run before. They needed someone reliable, someone whose record was spotless. Isaac's record was spotless because after his wife Margaret died, he had stopped doing the only thing he had ever cared about professionally, and a man without ambition rarely makes trouble. He had been a licensed emergency medical technician for 6 years. He had worked 2 overlapping shifts because Margaret was in graduate school and they needed the income. He had been good at it not in a celebrated way, but in the quiet way that keeps people alive in the back of an ambulance at 2 in the morning. When Margaret got sick, he had trusted the system that employed him. He had trusted the diagnoses, the specialists, the protocols. He had sat in waiting rooms and nodded at explanations he did not fully understand because the people giving those explanations had degrees on their walls and the gravity of authority in their voices. He had watched his wife deteriorate for 18 months, and when she was gone, he had surrendered his EMT certification renewal without a word and taken the first job that paid a living wage and required nothing from him emotionally. He heard the nurses talking through the supply room doorway on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks into autumn. He was replacing the liner in the biohazard bin near the corridor junction, working quietly the way he always did, and their voices carried without them realizing it. 19th treatment this month, one of them said. And her last labs were worse than the 16th. A pause. Dr. Hale keeps saying it's adjustment response. Another pause. Longer. I've been doing this 12 years and I've never seen adjustment response look like that. Isaac did not stop moving. He finished with the liner, sealed the bag, and stepped back into the hallway. But something in him had gone very still. The way it went still in the back of an ambulance when a patient's presentation did not match the reported history. He glanced through the narrow window panel, set into the treatment room door. The woman inside was Evelyn Chase. He knew who she was. Everyone in the building knew who she was. She sat in the infusion chair with the straight-backed posture of someone who had trained herself never to look diminished in a professional space. She wore a blazer the color of slate. Her hair was pulled back. From where Isaac stood, she looked like a CEO conducting a silent negotiation, with the IV line running into her arm. but her hands were resting on her thighs, and even through the reinforced glass, he could see that the fingers of her right hand were not quite relaxed. They held a tension she was working to suppress. And he saw the way he had always seen things before he taught himself to stop looking the faint white lines across the base of her fingernails. He pushed the cart forward and did not stop. But the image stayed with him. Evelyn Chase had taken over Nexavance Corporation at 24, 2 years after her father was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's, and 16 months after he asked her to come home from the medical school where she had completed her second year. She had never finished the degree. She had learned a different curriculum, instead earnings calls, regulatory filings, acquisition strategy, the careful management of a company whose entire value proposition was built on healing people it would never personally meet. She was good at it. She was precise and unsentimental in boardrooms, and the analysts who covered Nexavance had learned not to underestimate the quiet woman at the head of the table. Her father, from the care facility where he lived now, tracked the quarterly earnings from a tablet and always sent her the same message afterward. Your grandfather would have been proud. She had never told him how tired she was. She did not believe in offering information to not be acted upon. She presented the third-quarter projections that Thursday morning, without a tremor in her voice. Logan Hargrove, the CFO, sat to her left and took notes with the attentiveness of a man who had learned exactly when to perform diligence. Dr. Dominic Hale sat at the far end of the table in his capacity as the corporation's contracted chief medical advisor, present, as he always was, in the dual role of the man treating the CEO and the man advising the board on health-related expenditures. He was 57, silver-haired, educated at 3 of the most prestigious institutions in the country, and he carried himself with the specific ease of a man who had never once been questioned by someone he considered beneath him. When the meeting ended and the room cleared, Evelyn walked directly to the treatment suite at the end of the 14th floor corridor. Dominic was already there, standing at the preparation counter with a smile she had cataloged long ago, measured, warm, calibrated to communicate confidence without arrogance. The protocol from Zurich, he said, lifting a sealed bag of intravenous solution. The next phase, we should start to see real movement in the coming weeks. Evelyn sat down in the chair. She had heard variations of that sentence 19 times. She had authorized over $100 million in response to it. She watched the clear fluid begin to move through the line. Dr. Hale, she said, why do I feel worse after every session instead of better? He did not hesitate. He never hesitated. Adjustment response, he said. Your body is recalibrating at a cellular level. The fatigue, the neurological sensitivity, these are indicators that the treatment is engaging the correct pathways. It looks like worsening because healing is not linear. She looked at the window. The city was bright below, and the light fell through the glass at a low autumn angle and did not reach her. She thought, not for the first time, that a building full of people who studied medicine for a living should by now have produced a single answer that felt true. Her father had built Nexavance because he believed in the work. She kept it alive because she could not think of a reason to let it die. She had never allowed herself to consider that the thing keeping her sick might be the same thing promising to make her well. The mophead crossed the corner of her vision as Isaac Callaway began his route along the east corridor. She glanced at him the way she glanced at everything in her peripheral field, briefly, assessingly, and without particular significance. He moved with economy. He did not look up. She returned her attention to the window. Isaac did not look up because he was looking at her hands. He had learned, in 6 years of emergency medicine, that the body tells the truth even when the patient cannot or will not. He had learned to read presentation the way a carpenter reads grain, not by examining any single feature, but by seeing the whole pattern at once. And what his eyes assembled in the 3 seconds he allowed himself before he moved on was this. The white transverse bands crossing the base of Evelyn Chase's fingernails were not singular. There were 3 of them, parallel, evenly spaced, clearly demarcated. They were not the product of injury or nutritional deficiency in the conventional sense. He had seen bands like that once before. He had been told, too late, what they meant. He reached the service corridor and stood with his back against the wall. His breathing was steady. He was the only person in the hallway. He thought about what he had seen, and he thought about the word his mind had already produced, the word he did not want because it cost too much to carry. Mises lines, named for a Dutch physician, present in cases of heavy metal accumulation, thallium primarily, arsenic in some presentations. The bands formed as the body deposited the metal in the keratin matrix of the nail during periods of elevated exposure. Multiple bands, evenly spaced, meant multiple exposures. It meant a pattern. It did not mean an accident. He had also noticed the hair. Not enough for a stranger to register, but enough for someone trained to inventory a patient rapidly. Bilateral thinning along the temporal line, the kind that moved in the diffuse, symmetric pattern of systemic toxic insult rather than the localized recession of stress or age. And the hand, the right hand specifically, had shown a resting tone that was subtly wrong, a fractional incongruence between the position of the fingers and what relaxation should have looked like. Peripheral neuropathy, early stage, the kind that announced itself not in pain but in the body's quiet failure to fully obey. These three observations together, in a patient receiving regular intravenous infusions, pointed in one direction. Not toward the autoimmune neurological disorder that was apparently documented on her chart, toward something that wore the same costume, but was fundamentally different in origin. He pushed the cart to the elevator. He pressed the button for the basement. He stood in the descending box and thought about Margaret. That night, Grace fell asleep at 8:30 with a book open on her chest. Isaac moved it carefully to the nightstand, sat on the edge of her bed for a moment, and then walked to the kitchen. He made no food. He opened the cabinet above the refrigerator and took down a cardboard box he had not opened in 14 months. Inside it, in a manila folder, held shut by a rubber band, were Margaret's medical records. He sat on the kitchen floor with his back against the refrigerator and read through them in order for the third time in 2 years. The diagnoses, the treatment protocols, the lab values that had been explained away by adjustment response, by rare presentations, by the complexity of autoimmune neurological disease. He found the page he had bookmarked with a torn strip of paper towel, the postmortem toxicology addendum, filed 6 weeks after Margaret's death by a pathologist who had never treated her and had no reason to be kind about what he found. Thallium sulfate concentration in hepatic tissue, elevated. Source of exposure, undetermined. Because by then, no one was looking for a source. Because by then, there was no patient left to protect. He called Diana Frost at 11:14. She was, as she almost always was at that hour, still at her desk. She had been the attending internist on Margaret's final admission. She had not ordered the heavy metal screen that might have caught it in time. She had carried that specific regret with the particular weight that physicians carry failures they cannot professionally acknowledge, but cannot privately forget. She answered on the second ring. Isaac told her what he had seen. He described the nail presentation. 3 bands, transverse, evenly spaced, roughly 2 millimeters in width, appearing at the base rather than mid-nail. He described the pattern of the hair loss he had observed on the occasions when the light in the treatment corridor caught Evelyn's pulled-back hair at an angle diffuse but bilateral, consistent along the temporal line. He described the neurological presentation in the right hand. Not a tremor exactly, but a dysregulation of resting tone that suggested peripheral nerve involvement. Diana did not speak for a long time. Then she said, "The spacing between the bands if they're equidistant. That indicates repeated exposure on a consistent schedule. Not environmental contamination. Not a single incident." A pause. "Isaac, if those are what you're describing, and the treatment intervals are regular, someone is administering this. He had known this. He had known it the moment his mind assembled the pattern in the hallway. But hearing it spoken in another person's careful, controlled voice made it real in a way that the silent knowledge had not been. He looked at the treatment schedule he had photographed from the whiteboard in the nurse's station 3 weeks earlier when he was replacing a ceiling panel above it. 19 sessions in 11 months. The intervals: 17 days, 18 days, 17 days, 17 days. Regular. As a calendar. He put the phone down on the kitchen floor and sat in the quiet house with the sound of Grace breathing from the back bedroom and the city running its permanent low frequency through the walls. He thought about the fact that the person being poisoned was paying for the privilege. He thought about $100 million flowing toward the hands of the man who held the syringe. He thought about Margaret dying in a white room, while everyone around her nodded and used the correct terminology. He was not going to nod again. The next morning, he requested a 5-minute meeting with the nursing supervisor on 14. Her name was Patricia, and she had been with the company longer than most of the executives. She listened to him with the careful attention of someone who has been trained to listen carefully, and when he finished describing what he had observed, she said, with neither malice nor hesitation, "Mr. Callaway, our medical team has over 2 decades of combined specialty experience. I think we can trust them to manage the clinical picture." She said it the way people say the thing that ends a conversation. He found Dr. Dominic Hale in the 14th floor corridor at 8:40, moving between rooms with the purposeful stride of a man who had never been late to anything. Isaac said his name once, and Dominic turned. He listened for 45 seconds, with his hands loose at his sides and his expression professionally neutral. Then he said, "I appreciate your concern. We have 23 specialists actively monitoring Miss Chase's case. I'm quite confident we're managing this appropriately." He turned and walked away. He did not look back. Isaac stood in the hallway in his gray uniform, with his laminated ID badge and his mop cart, and the architecture of an expensive building rising around him, and said nothing, because there was nothing to say yet. He looked down at his own hands. He had used these hands to stabilize cervical spines and start lines in rolling vehicles, and press pressure on wounds that should not have been survivable. He had used these hands to hold Margaret's on nights when she was too tired to talk. He had been told, indirectly and directly, by nurses and receptionists, and hospital administrators, and now by a man in a tailored jacket, that what these hands knew did not count. He ate his lunch in the basement cafeteria, alone at a corner table with the noise of the HVAC system overhead, and a sheet of paper on the tray in front of him. He had written 3 phrases in his small, precise handwriting. Mies lines. Thallium poisoning. Repeated exposure scheduled source. His phone vibrated. Grace had sent a photo from school, a new drawing. He looked at it for a long time. Then he folded the piece of paper, placed it in his breast pocket next to the crayon drawing from Tuesday, and stood up. Over the next 2 days, Isaac Callaway was invisible in the way that people in service roles are perpetually invisible, and he used that invisibility with the methodical patience of someone who understood that the advantage was not in being seen, but in being everywhere without being noticed. He noticed that the biohazard collection bags from the 14th floor treatment suite were not routing through the building's standard regulated medical waste processing. They were being picked up separately, after hours, by a courier vehicle with no hospital affiliation markings. He wrote down the vehicle identification number and the name of the company on the magnetic placard on its door. Regulated pharmaceutical waste had a specific handling chain, specific carriers, specific documentation, specific disposal logs. This vehicle had none of those markers. It appeared, collected, and disappeared within a 15-minute window that fell outside the building's standard contractor check-in hours. He photographed the intravenous solution bags being used in Evelyn Chase's treatments. He did it during a routine pass through the preparation room while the nurses were at shift handover. The primary label was pharmaceutical standard, but beneath it, visible at the edge where the adhesive was not fully flush, was a different label. The lot number on the underlying label was a format he did not recognize. There was no manufacturer registration code of the type required on all approved intravenous preparations sold in this country. He had seen enough pharmaceutical labeling in his EMT years to know what a compliant label looked like. This was not one. He was pushing the refuse cart through the underground parking structure on the third day when he heard voices from the far end of the level. He moved slowly, the way he always moved. Without changing his pace or direction, Logan Hargrove was standing beside a gray car with his jacket buttoned and his voice low. Dominic Hale was facing him. Isaac caught 4 sentences before the voices dropped below the ambient level of the structure. "She's asking about next quarter again." A pause. "We need 3 more months at minimum. Then, keep the protocol exactly where it is." Logan nodded once, the tight contained nod of a man confirming an agreement he did not want documented anywhere. He sent the label photograph to Diana Frost that evening, through an encrypted message application she had used with patients in sensitive situations. Her response came at 2:17 in the morning. He woke up to it and read it sitting on the edge of his bed in the dark. She had searched the lot number through 3 separate pharmaceutical registry databases. It did not exist in any of them. The manufacturer code was not registered with the regulatory body that oversaw intravenous preparations. What was in that bag had not been approved by any recognized authority for human use. He sat with that for a while. Then he sent back 2 words. "What next?" Her reply was immediate, as though she had been waiting. "I need a blood sample." Drawn from her. Outside their laboratory system. If the thallium is there, it will be measurable. That is the evidence that cannot be argued away. Can you get that? He considered the question. He had keys to the 14th floor. He had a standing assignment that put him in that corridor before the medical team arrived each morning, and he had one thing that no degree or salary or institutional authority could manufacture. He had been in that hallway for 9 months, and Evelyn Chase knew his face. Not his name, not his history, but his face. She had looked at him, briefly, and without significance, dozens of times. She had never looked through him the way the others did. He thought about that distinction. He had one window. 6:15 Wednesday morning. 20 minutes. He would either use it or he would not. He was in the corridor at 6:08. He waited. At 6:13, the elevator opened, and Evelyn Chase stepped out, carrying a small cup of coffee, and the particular self-possession of a woman who had carved this 20-minute interval out of her schedule deliberately as an act of preservation. She was alone. She walked to the end office and put her key in the lock, and then, because he was standing where he was standing, she looked up and saw him. "Mr. Callaway," she said. She remembered his name after all. "Good morning." He did not move toward her. "I need to speak with you about something that isn't related to the building systems." She looked at him for 1 full second. Then she opened the door. "Come in." He did not sit down. He stood near the window and placed his phone on the desk and showed her the photographs of the labels, the lot number that did not exist, the vehicle identification from the after-hours pickup, the written timeline of treatment intervals, alongside the pattern he had observed in her nails. He described the Mies lines the way he would describe a finding at a scene-specific, sequential, without editorial. 3 bands. Equidistant. Consistent with repeated thallium exposure on a 17 to 18-day cycle that aligned exactly with her treatment schedule. Evelyn Chase did not speak while he was talking. She set her coffee down at some point, and she did not pick it up again. When he finished, she was looking at her own hands. She turned them over slowly on the desk surface, palms up, then back down, examining the nails with the focused attention of someone seeing a familiar object with new information. The silence lasted a long time. "Why you?" she asked finally. She did not mean it unkindly. It was a genuine question. "Because I lost someone," he said, "to the same thing no one asked about early enough." She looked at him, not at his uniform or his badge or the mop cart visible through the open door. At him. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "A blood draw," he said. "Outside their system. There's a physician I trust. She'll run independent analysis. If I'm wrong, you won't hear from me again about any of this." Evelyn stood. She crossed to her desk and opened the lower left drawer and removed a sealed clinical kit tourniquet, needle, collection tubes, alcohol swabs. It was a physician-grade kit, the kind that medical students kept. She set it on the desk and said, "I spent 2 years in medical school before my father's diagnosis. I kept this because I never fully trusted the idea that I should be completely dependent on someone else for basic clinical procedure." She paused. "I've been asking myself the same question you're asking since month 8. She drew the sample herself, steady-handed and efficient, the clinical education still resident in her muscle memory. Isaac labeled the tubes the way Diana had instructed. He was out of the office by 6:32. The hallway was empty. No one had seen him enter. No one saw him leave. Diana received the samples before noon. She ran the thallium serum assay twice. The value was the same, both times. 37 micrograms per liter. The normal upper threshold for occupational exposure was 2. The value in Evelyn's blood was not the result of a single contamination event or an accidental environmental source. It was the product of sustained, regular, deliberate administration of a compound that had no business being in any intravenous formulation. Diana then analyzed the solution from the photographed bag, using a portable spectrometry unit she kept in her private practice for field toxicology consultation. She found thallium acetate at a concentration sufficient to produce the neurological and systemic presentation Evelyn had been experiencing. It was soluble, colorless, and odorless. It could be introduced into a clear IV solution with no visible change to the fluid. It would produce symptoms indistinguishable from the autoimmune neurological disorder Dominic Hale had been treating for the past 11 months. The feedback loop was complete, and the logic of it was cold and plain. Keep the patient sick enough to need treatment, well enough to keep paying for it. $100 million in 11 months, with the promise of more if the protocol required extending into the next fiscal year, which the protocol always would. Evelyn received the full toxicology report at 11:40 that night. She read it twice, alone in her office, in the same chair where she had sat through 19 infusions of the thing making her ill. She did not cry. She walked to the private bathroom adjacent to her office and stood at the mirror for a long moment. Her hair had thinned at the temples. There were shadows under her eyes that had not been there 2 years ago. She looked at herself with the unsparing clarity of a person who has just been handed the truth after a long period of careful untruth. She thought about her father's message after every earnings call, the pride in it, the trust. She thought about the company her grandfather had started in a building a quarter the size of this one, on the principle that medicine should answer to patients first and everything else second. She thought about 11 months of sitting in that chair and believing that the worsening was the healing, because the man with the Harvard degree and the silver hair had said so with the confidence of someone who had never imagined being questioned. And then she straightened her shoulders and went back to her desk and picked up her phone. And she called her private legal counsel. And she called her head of internal security, and she asked both of them to come in early on Monday. By Sunday evening, the complete surveillance archive from the 14th floor, 11 months of footage, backed up to a secure off-site server under the instruction of the internal security director, had been reviewed. The relevant segments were clear, time-stamped, and incontrovertible. Dr. Dominic Hale. Alone in the preparation room after 10 in the evening, on the night before each of Evelyn's scheduled treatment sessions, adding a secondary solution to the primary IV bag from an unlabeled vial stored in his personal locked case. 19 instances. 19 nights, every one of them captured. The financial forensics took slightly longer, but not much. Logan Hargrove had been careful about the structure of the payments, but not careful enough. 14 transfers over 11 months, from a medical investment holding company traceable, through 2 intermediary shell accounts, to Dominic Hale's personal asset management firm. The total was $4,300,000. In exchange for what the transaction records described as consulting services, there had been no consulting. There had been a woman in a chair, and a clear bag of fluid, and a locked case that no one had ever been permitted to inspect. Isaac received a text message from Evelyn at 3:04 Monday morning. It read, "You were right, all of it. Meeting at 7 Monday morning. I'd like you to be there." He put the phone face down on the nightstand. He sat on the edge of his bed in the dark. He thought about Margaret. He thought about the cardboard box in the kitchen cabinet. He thought about the 18 months of nodding and trusting and deferring to the authoritative voices, and how at the end of it there was a manila folder with a post-mortem note about undetermined exposure. He was not angry. Exactly. He was something quieter and more permanent than anger. He was the version of himself that had been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for the chance to close a loop that should never have been opened. He went to Grace's room and stood in the doorway for a while. She was asleep on her side with her arms around a stuffed animal, her breathing slow and even in the dark. He thought that she had spent half her life in a household shaped by loss, not bitterly, not obviously, but structurally, the way a house built on shifting ground develops small asymmetries you only notice once you know to look. She deserved a father who had not given up. He thought he might finally be that. The Monday meeting convened at 7 on the dot. The boardroom on the 15th floor held a full roster of directors, the corporation's external legal team, 2 members of the company's internal security division, and 2 plainclothes investigators from a firm retained over the weekend. Isaac stood near the wall beside the windows, in his gray uniform with his employee lanyard, because Evelyn Chase had told him to be there, and he had no reason to be anywhere else. Logan Hargrove arrived with his briefcase and his practiced attentiveness and stopped moving when he saw the investigators. Dr. Dominic Hale came in 30 seconds behind him, looked once around the room, and assembled his expression into something neutral that did not quite reach neutral. Logan looked at Isaac standing against the wall and said, in the tone of a man invoking an obvious procedural error, "Why is maintenance staff in this meeting?" Evelyn, seated at the head of the table, said, "He was invited." She said it, without turning her head. She presented the evidence the same way Isaac had presented it to her sequentially, without drama, letting the data carry the weight. The serum toxicology, the solution analysis, the surveillance footage, which played on the room's main screen in silence. Dominic at the preparation counter after 10 at night. The unlabeled vial. The careful hands of a man who believed he was alone. The financial records, the transfer dates aligned against the treatment calendar, with a precision that required no annotation. Dominic denied it first. Then the footage reached its 4th instance, and he stopped speaking. Logan pushed back his chair and stood up, and one of the investigators placed a hand on his shoulder. Not aggressively, simply in the manner of a hand that was not going to move. No one shouted. No one made a speech. The evidence had been constructed to eliminate the need for speeches. The room was very quiet while the footage continued to play, and in that quiet, Isaac noticed something. Every person in the room was watching the screen, except Dominic and Logan, who were looking at the table, and Evelyn Chase, who was looking at Isaac. He looked back at her, just for a moment, and then the moment passed, and the room began its procedural unwinding, lawyers speaking to lawyers, the security team moving with the practiced efficiency of people who had been briefed and were now executing a plan, and Isaac stepped back to give them room to work. Dominic Hale was escorted from the 14th floor that afternoon. Logan Hargrove's access to corporate systems was suspended pending formal investigation. The regulatory referrals were filed before end of business. Diana Frost was formally engaged as an independent medical consultant to oversee Evelyn's detoxification protocol, and the first truly clean infusion thallium chelation, standardized, documented, sourced from a licensed manufacturer with a traceable lot number, began that Thursday. The first week of treatment was harder in some ways than any of the 11 months before it. The chelation process mobilized the accumulated metal, and the body responded, as bodies do when they finally begin to clear a long-standing burden with fatigue, with discomfort, with the temporary intensification of symptoms before the turn. Evelyn sat through it in the same chair, in the same suite, and she did not pretend it was easy. But on the 8th day, she walked from the parking structure to the building entrance under her own power, without an arm to hold, and without the careful measured pace of someone conserving energy against an uncertain reserve. It was a distance of perhaps 40 meters across open pavement in the autumn air, and she walked it like a person who expected to arrive. Isaac found the envelope on his cart on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later. It was a standard business envelope with his name handwritten on the front, in a script he recognized from the message she had sent at 3 in the morning. Inside was a letter, 2 pages, written by hand on personal stationery. He stood in the hallway and read it. She wrote about the 11 months. She wrote about what it felt like to be the most competent person in a room, and simultaneously, the most deceived. She wrote that she had spent 2 years in medical school and 11 months as a patient, and neither experience had taught her the thing he had seen in 40 seconds through a treatment room window. She wrote that she understood now why the thing he saw was visible to him, and not to the people who were paid to look. The second page contained a formal offer of position: Director of Medical Safety Operations, a newly created role within the corporation's internal compliance structure, responsible for independent oversight of all clinical protocols, vendor verification, and patient safety review. It was, she wrote, not a reward. It was an acknowledgement that the role had existed in practice for 9 months, and had simply not had a title or a salary to match the work being done. He folded the letter. He put it in his breast pocket, alongside the crayon drawing from the morning Grace had told him it was a picture of him fixing people. He finished his route. He collected his things from the locker room at shift end. He walked out into the afternoon and took the subway to the Maple Street Early Learning Center, where Grace was waiting on the front step with her backpack and a folded sheet of paper she had been holding since 3:30. "It's a new one," she said, handing it over before he could speak. He unfolded it on the sidewalk. A tall building. 2 figures at the top, one taller and one smaller. Below them, crayon ground and crayon sky. And, at the bottom of the page, in the careful capital letters of a 7-year-old who had recently learned that words could be permanent, she had written, "Dad fixed the person." He crouched down and held his daughter for a long moment on the sidewalk, with the afternoon traffic running past them and the city doing what cities do around the specific gravity of a small thing that matters completely. He had not fixed anything with equipment or credentials or institutional authority. He had fixed it with the only tool that had never failed him, even in the years when he tried to put it down. The refusal to look away from a pattern that the body was telling the truth about, in a language that cost nothing to learn and everything to ignore. He stood up. He took Grace's hand. They walked toward the subway entrance together, and the afternoon light fell across the sidewalk in long straight lines, and for the first time in a very long time, he did not feel like a man walking in the wrong direction. $100 million had not answered the question. One man with a mop cart and a grief he had never finished carrying had asked it instead. And in the asking, in the willingness to see what was plainly visible and say plainly what he saw, he had done the thing that the money never could. He had arrived in time,